Hey, I'm Lee Kasumba, and this is our journey across Africa, navigating the intricate landscapes of business, culture, and global influence from the African perspective.
The Africa Whisperer, telling authentic African stories in a global way.
On this episode of The Africa Whisperer,
we did a lot of trial and error and started off with tomatoes. So we went from the greenhouse to like the field and we grew like acres of tomatoes, and we had big dreams about what we're going to do with the tomatoes, and we harvest them and we'd harvest, take it to the market, and this is when the next realization hits you. It's like, oh, this is not actually controlled by you or the market prices, in quotes. It's controlled by the traders, because these guys come in from, let's say, Kampala, and they basically dictate the price. They're like, we're buying 50 kilos at $10 today, or 30 kilos at $20 tomorrow. It fluctuates, and for the average farmer in rural settings where they had to ride their bike, carrying this bag of tomatoes, get to the farm, it's like a 2-hour ride. They don't have the option to just get rid of that, at the price. They literally have to sell at the price that is being dictated to them at the market.
On this episode of The Africa Whisperer, I spoke to Eric Kaduru, who started his journey in advertising, then made a dramatic switch to farming. Filled with twists and turns, he started as a Google farmer, but quickly learned that perhaps everything you read online doesn't necessarily translate practically. Still, Eric, with his wife Rebecca, pushed along and started as tomato farmers, then moved to passion fruit. Uganda is home to almost 50% of East Africa's arable land and is often described as the food basket of East Africa. Though most farming is sustenance farming, there are opportunities for young people to make a business out of farming. Eric and Rebecca founded KadAfrica, which envisions a world where young women have financial independence and are economic drivers in their communities. Here is how our conversation went. I'm really just so excited to get to speak to you on the Africa Whisperer. Thank you for making time. People who listen to this podcast love to listen to inspiring stories and people who are doing awesome things in Africa and building things from the ground up. And I feel that KadAfrica and what you and your wife are doing are perfect. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having us. It's always a pleasure to be able to share our experience and our stories with anyone who wants to hear them.
Now, Eric, before we get into farming and all of the awesome things that you're doing, you and your family's doing with KadAfrica as well, let's talk a bit about your background, right? Because you were born in Kenya and you grew up in Kenya. So I want to know what your life was like in Kenya versus the times that you would spend in Uganda for holidays. Paint a picture of what that was like, what you enjoyed about being in Kenya versus being in Uganda and vice versa.
Yeah, I was born in Kenya. And we actually moved to Uganda in the early 90s. I'm half Ugandan, half Kenyan. So with most of the kids my age during that period who were born in the 80s were outside of Uganda. So we moved to Uganda in the early 90s, and then I ended up going to boarding school in Kenya. Yeah. So I spent most of my time in boarding school, which, everyone is always shocked when I say I loved, because that's literally the foundation. And because my parents were both, so they both worked for NGOs and they were both lawyers and they traveled a lot. Yeah. They wanted us to be in a constant place. So it's you're not hopping around and you're not if you don't see them, it's because you're in school. Yeah. So I ended up in boarding school where I spent most of my year. We'd travel home to Uganda or to Kenya for the holidays. So summer, Easter, half term. Depending on what was happening, we'd go to whichever country. But I enjoyed it. My one thing about Uganda that I didn't like was most of my friends were in Kenya. So during the holidays, when I'd go home, I'd be at home with there may be 6 or 7 of us, and it was the same group of friends who have ended up being my closest friends, throughout life. Yeah, holidays were spent, doing what us kids did was, riding bikes. They let you out the house in the morning, you come back, have lunch, you go back, and you have to be home for dinner. And that was it. It was a different world. And then video games came into play and movies. kind of like took over my social life. So like my holidays were spent watching a lot of movies as I got into my teenage years before I could drive.
Yeah.
And obviously, as soon as I started driving, the priorities shifted.
You like the priorities shifted?
Yeah, but generally it was good,
Yeah.
good time. Can't complain.
Just being in Kenya and being in boarding school and so forth, because that's the story of a lot of people, specifically when you talk about a lot of people who were born in the 80s in Uganda ended up living outside of Uganda, obviously because of the political situation and uncertainty and all of that. Was there anything that you feel that you learned that you got from boarding school? Because it's not something that many people go to boarding school. Like if you're in South Africa, for example, to go to boarding school, you are technically really privileged, It's the same as in the West. If you're going to boarding school, that's like private school. It's like incredible. Was that the same dynamic for you?
It's funny because I never thought about it like that until people started pointing it out. And then, you then realize, oh, okay, this is kind of a privilege. And it was good. I enjoyed the experience, and the few things that I picked from that experience were, I think one thing my wife always mentions is I probably developed OCD in boarding school because routines were built and they're like embedded into your system. So it's like, you wake up, you make your bed, your laundry is folded, you put it in a certain place. You have an allocated locker, so you have to keep it tidy. And obviously this is not across the board for everyone, because I did have friends who were like slobby. But for me, it like translated into this very organized way of operation, and it comes all the way till today. I'm still like militant about how clean I keep the place, where things are placed. My wife used to hate when we first met. I'd be like, can you fold the laundry and put it in the dirty laundry hamper before it goes into the wash? And she'd be like, that's crazy. Why are you
folding dirty laundry?
To throw it into. And I'm like, it's just a routine, because us guys you come in from, let's say, games or whatever, and there were piles of laundry where you'd put your dirty stuff. So you'd fold your shirts, you'd fold your shorts, you'd fold your socks, or you roll up your socks and put them in these piles. And that system was just like built into me. And I guess it translated to everything else. So I feel like I'm pretty organized, and I'm like very time conscious, and I try and like stick to a routine. And once I get into a routine, it's very hard to break. So I can imagine that that's helped a lot in terms of what you're doing in farming and everything. Having a routine and being very disciplined and all of that has probably played quite a huge role. Yeah. It definitely does. The early morning shifts are the most crucial parts of like when you're farming. So you have to be at the farm early. And by like midday, people are starting to relax. And if you don't take advantage of those like blocks of time, then you can lose out quite dramatically. However, it does have its bad side, because you become so fixated on like a system. And then with agriculture, for instance, there's too much unpredictable. What's the word? Yeah, that word just flew out of my mouth.
Unpredictability.
Unpredictability, that's the one. So like when something happens and it's out of your realm of control, it becomes a real problem. So you have to like adjust to that. And so like looking at the weather, what Google says the weather is going to be today, you're like, okay, it's going to be raining, and then it doesn't rain, and it's like, oh my God, the world's ending.
But I want to find out, right, just in terms of going into farming and so forth, because before that you were in advertising because you were in South Africa. So I'm kind of curious for farming, where that interest peaked for you. If you're the first person in your family to be a farmer, just talk to us about that. And when you make the decision, okay, I'm going to start farming. Like, how does that all happen?
Actually, it's a funny story, because you think about farming as something that people are doing in rural communities and poor people. And I also had that perspective until later in high school. My roommate was from a farming family, and in Kenya it's big. People do like commercial farming, and I hadn't even put two and two together until I went to visit him, and then I realized the scope of like what these guys are doing. This is like commercial farming is a completely different animal to someone like growing beans for the household, and that was kind of like motivational and me changing my mindset as to what could be achieved. And being from like Kenya, growing up in Kenya, and living in Uganda and being half Ugandan and looking at how agriculture was viewed in Uganda, it made me like shift my perspective. So I'm like, okay, perhaps we're not doing it the same way they're doing it on that side, and we could shift it and start changing the narrative on our side. And that's what kind of like triggered that ambition, or that sparked the initiative to like get into agriculture. Well, that and hating the fact that I had to drive. I had to spend like 4 hours a day in traffic to get to my job and get home after work. And it was just, you've been to Kampala, you know how it is.
Oh my gosh.
When people complain about traffic anywhere else, I'm like, yo, you don't know.
Until you've experienced Kampala, you have not experienced it, seriously.
Exactly, yeah.
Because, no road rules exist at all. Traffic lights, they're an option.
Free for all.
Exactly. So now, how did you actually get into farming? I know a little bit about the story, but I prefer if you share it, how you got into farming. I believe that your dad, unfortunately, had passed away and so forth, and he left your family around 27 acres of land. Is this correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah. And
my wife and I had met maybe a year before that, and we decided. So we were in Nairobi, actually, and we were sitting at this restaurant, Art Cafe, and they had this magazine on, and I think the front page had an article or like a section on like vanilla farming. And it was just talking about, how you can generate wealth and everything. And where I'm from in Uganda, in Fort Portal, in Western Uganda, had one of the biggest vanilla plantations. And it's owned by who is now a family that is now friends of ours, Dali Lodge, and they have this vanilla plantation. Those guys are like, wait, what? They're making this much? You could grow vanilla in Fort Portal? Wait a minute, I have land in Fort Portal. Let's go to Fort Portal and grow vanilla. Yeah. And obviously that was the spark. And we're like, okay, we're going to grow vanilla. And you get there and then you realize, it's not as simple as just you plant the vanilla and it grows. It takes like 4 years before you start seeing the fruits of your labor. And we're like, okay, let's look into other crops. And I think we came across this company called Bolton, and they were selling greenhouses and marketing it in the sense that you buy the greenhouse, they provide you the seedling, then they link you to the market in Israel that buys the tomatoes or the eggplant. So we bought these greenhouses and started a farm. And that quickly led into us realizing that there were layers to this farming thing. So first of all, you can't just be on Google, okay.
Because you're a Google farmer. You're a Google farmer, which I think is so fascinating.
Yeah, initially I was. I started off as a Google farmer, and now I tell people, hey, stay clear of, because by the time it's like when you're sick and you see like something growing on your leg and you're like, oh man, let me Google what this is. Yeah. But if you had felt the pain before and gone to the doctor who is a professional and he said, if you don't use this ointment or take this medication, this is going to happen and we'll end up cutting your leg off. Yeah. That's how Google farming works. You only notice it when it's too late. So it led us to be like, okay, quickly, we need to get some professional assistance. And that's when we started looking into getting agronomists to come in and help us with planning and, season. You have to think carefully about what you're growing because some things don't grow as well. And we did a lot of trial and error and started off with tomatoes. So we went from the greenhouse to the field and we grew acres of tomatoes and, we had big dreams about what we're going to do with the tomatoes and we harvest them and we'd harvest, take it to the market. And this is when the next realization hits you. It's like, oh, this is not actually controlled by you or the market prices, in quotes. It's controlled by the traders. Because these guys come in from, let's say, Kampala, and they basically dictate the price. They're like, we're buying 50 kilos at $10 today, or 30 kilos at $20 tomorrow. It fluctuates. And for the average farmer in rural settings where they had to ride their bike, carrying this bag of tomatoes, get to the farm, it's like a 2-hour ride. They don't have the option to just get rid of that, at the price. They literally have to sell at the price that is being dictated to them at the market, which for us wasn't the case because we've, ferried this stuff over here in a truck and we're like, what, we'll come back tomorrow. But then that tomatoes, they go bad pretty fast. So after a while, it was like me and my wife were making chutneys and we became jam connoisseurs with tomatoes and started thinking.
So you had to be really creative about it.
Yo, man, it was painful, to watch, because it takes like 4 or 5 months for these things to grow. You have big plans, the market prices. You literally, you've planned your whole life. My next 6 months are planned because I'll sell this many kilos, I'll get this much, and then that changes overnight. So it led us to like looking at different crops that had like longer shelf life, and which would allow us to be like, if the market price isn't right today, we can adjust and come back tomorrow or make that negotiation. And we landed on passion fruit. And that's, basically where KadAfrica originated, is through that experience of loss with the tomatoes to like finding something that has more shelf life and grows pretty well in that region as well. And so we started doing that, and that is the beginning of the second half of this journey.
With passion fruit, what was the difference with it? Was that easier? And what when it comes to grading it internationally versus locally, is there a difference with that?
The first thing was it takes 6 months to grow, so it's a pretty quick turnaround on the plant. And then once it gets to that level of maturity, it's a continuous, so it's like seasonal. So the vines will stay on for 2 to 3 years, depending on how you treat them. And so in the rainy season, it's basically growing. Dry season, you're harvesting, you're selling. They last, depending on the variety and how you keep them, up to a month, the shelf life of passion fruit. They'll shrivel and start looking very unattractive, but they're still good. Yeah. And they also are easier to transport because they have the hard shell, so they don't like tomatoes in a truck from Fort Portal to Kampala. You get a few bumps on the way down, you're going to get some, tomato sauce in the back of the truck. But with passion, it's not the same. And then they also have an international market. So like you could export to the UK, to Europe. The States was trickier because they have like FDA regulations on certain things that come in. But and then so that's what made us decide, okay, let's try this. And passion fruit, like as a Ugandan, it's just there. It's something that, like you wake up in the morning, there's passion fruit juice at the house.
Listen.
The people selling it on the streets. It grows in the backyard.
Everywhere.
You know what I mean?
But then I saw like in an interview, you mentioned about how something like 68% of the passion fruit that is consumed in Uganda is not from Uganda. And I thought, this whole thing is so strange. I didn't really understand how that all worked, or if maybe I misunderstood that stat.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. So this is the kind of stuff that we were like uncovering while we're going down this journey. And you start to realize, because in my mind as well, the same way you're thinking is like, okay, this stuff is growing on the trees, everyone's eating it, it's always available. This must be something that is generally grown here. And you don't realize that people are exporting it from like, let's say, neighboring countries because no one is growing it commercially in Uganda. Because it's quite a technical crop to grow. So like there's a lot of learning in that process. And I think in the early 90s, Uganda had, especially in the western region, had a high like market for passion fruit, and they were growing it at a large scale. But there are certain diseases that can come in and literally wipe out your entire plantation. Wow. And I feel like that kind of deterred people from growing it, because you'd have like 3 acres of passion fruit, you're doing really well, and then you get woodiness virus and boom, everything's gone. So it was one of those things of like, we have to start figuring out how to do it better. Obviously the variety of seed had changed since the early 90s. There were seeds that were, more prevalent to like growing in certain weather that would avoid certain diseases. But woodiness is like, it's that terminal illness that if you get it with passion fruit, you just literally have to count your losses. So trying to change the mindset of people in that region to start growing that instead of growing like maize or tea, which they were doing, was an uphill struggle. But eventually, after they started seeing us doing it with multiple farmers, it became something that they were interested in.
Now, just with regards to changing the mindset, like what I love is, just this idea, because we are sitting in a time in the world where we all have to be thinking about things differently, And I think I heard a quote, when you listen to a lot of like talks and you hear all these interviews and so forth, where somebody said that the next generation of millionaires and billionaires will come from, in Africa, will come from agriculture. And I thought, that's so interesting, like I didn't actually think about that because, you think of the creative sector that's doing really well. We're seeing how our artists are doing well. The tech sector, specifically in fintech and so forth, is doing extremely well in changing the narrative, specifically with like young Africans and, and all of that. And then you've also got entrepreneurship, and that's all amazing. Being in agriculture and farming actually as a business, because you mentioned something that's so interesting about how in Uganda people generally farm for sustenance. Because I'm not a farmer, I never actually correlated to the fact that maybe that there could be business made out of this. So can you talk us through that whole mentality shift?
Initially, what we saw was, so as we started growing the passion fruit in our area where my farm is, a lot of the people who worked on our farm were women. And the women would come to us and be like, hey, listen, instead of paying me my full salary this month, can you pay me half and then use the other half to pay my kids' school fees? And, things like that, because they'd go home and their husbands would end up taking the profits and spending them on drinking or not, just misusing the money. So what we started doing is like, okay, let's give you guys seedling. You take it home, you grow it, bring it back to us when it's ready, and we'll bulk buy everything, pay you the average price, and then create this system where it's like we're growing an outgrown network. And that was the first step in like shifting that mindset, because the women who are doing it would take it home. It doesn't take a lot of land to grow passion fruit. So like within your subsistence farm, whatever you're growing your beans, because passion fruit grows vertically, still allows them to like grow the produce that they consume in the household on the ground. So your beans, your potatoes, your cabbage, whatever else you want. And then the passion fruit becomes your cash crop to then sell as something to profit from. And it started off with a few women from our farm and then started like trickling down into the community. And then more people started to get interested because they knew that if they grew it, there was a market for it. So similar to like the tea estates in the area where everyone was growing small plots of tea, which takes like 2 years to get to a point of fruition. And you're not getting the money you deserve for the effort that you take to grow it, the amount of detrimentation it does to your land. Like you can't really grow anything for like at least 2 years after you uproot the tea. So they couldn't use their land for their own personal land for growing produce for the house and the tea. So this started to shift their mindset. So they're like, okay, I could actually grow stuff for my house, grow this for the business, and sell it and make money while still feeding my kids. And that was the first step in like shifting the mindset. And as we saw this, happening with women in the area, we were approached by one of the churches near our farm, and I think it was a Catholic church at the time. And they were like, hey, listen, we have all this land. There are all these women in this community who don't have, roles. They don't have work. They don't have things to do during the day. They don't own land. Is there a way we could have some sort of program where we use their land to, like, grow our outgrow system? So we're like, yes, that sounds like a great idea. So we'll lease plots of land from the Catholic Church, get women from within the community, and, like, grow into like a group, like a VSLA or a silk savings group. So we're teaching them how to grow as a unit. And from that is where the non-profit aspect of like KadAfrica started to develop. So we started to think about how we could scale that. And as you interact with the women on a daily basis and they start to see the initiative turning into like a business for them, where they have a fixed place to sell their produce, they start like thinking about other things that could be incorporated into their group. So we started doing like financial literacy training, started doing health and sexual reproductive training. We introduced advocacy classes, and over a period of like 5 years, we were able to develop a curriculum that is called the KadAfrica experience, which basically integrates women into these cooperatives, They go through this curriculum over a 12-month period as we're introducing agriculture as the main income-generating aspect for the business. And from that interaction with the Catholic Church, obviously the Protestant church on the other side is like, hey, we want some of that action. And then it went from the churches to the mosques to individual landowners to like people who were just interested in like utilizing land that they had to help their community.
This is awesome. So literally what you're doing at KadAfrica, you literally set the entire community on fire. Obviously not on actual fire because we want massive fire, but you set everything on fire. I think that's so it's just really so inspiring to be able to be working with an NGO and, you know, doing that kind of work that is bringing like actual change that people in the community can see and they all want to be able to jump on and play their part. So congratulations to you guys. That's fantastic.
No, thank you. And it was all about that, you know, because like you see a lot of NGO programs that come in, implement something, and then they leave. And it's not developing that, you know, self-sustainable ecosystem. And this is what we were trying to tackle. And it's not perfect, but it creates this idea that, okay, if you link the private sector to the development sector, that's the only way you can like continue this change. So where people are now like, the program ends, you leave, but the community stays engaged in what they're doing.
I love that.
And I think the tea estates, the cocoa farmers have like figured that out. And they've been doing that for years. And it's something that we're just like trying to replicate, but allowing smallholder farmers who don't have a lot of land, who don't have, you know, the option to like just give away their 2 acres to tea, because that's the only way you start making enough money to like put your kids through school. But on like half an acre of passion fruit, you're making double the money, and it's continuous, and it allows you to continue doing what you need to be doing for your family.
I really also love that this entire story is driven by the woman in the community. I often think, because I'm based in Ghana at the moment, and there's a market called Makola Market, and you know, in every African like country and everything, like in city, there's like a market. You know, that's where everything is gotten from. And I often think to myself that if the women decide not to work in many African countries, the economies are shutting down. Shutting down totally, because women, basically all of those quote unquote informal sectors that people may think are informal, they actually aren't. Those are the driving force of the economy. So to be able to see this happening in Uganda, and we know, you know, in Uganda about how, for example, land is not passed on to women, or girls are not always educated. So I think that it's so powerful for you to be able to be doing this kind of work. But now with that, because you had mentioned about how perhaps if the woman, you know, because it can be a little bit conservative, so you didn't find a situation where perhaps the parents, or I mean not the parents, but like the elders in the family or the husbands and everything were not happy about the situation? Or how did you get everybody in the family on board for these women to basically be self-employed basically?
So that's actually a very good question, and absolutely we did face that hurdle. And so what we did is, as we were developing the curriculum, we like brought in, you know, specialists who can help us, you know, view certain things from angles that we couldn't particularly see. And one of those things is like the gender dynamics, the household dynamics that happen after like women start getting empowered and start making money, and their husbands, their fathers, their spouses, they are starting to wonder, what are these people doing? So we incorporated into our program, we have like 3 events during the program. So we'd have the launch of the farm, where we'd invite the family members. So everyone is invited, parents, siblings, husbands, everyone's invited to that ceremony. We explain what the program's about. We introduce the program. We provide like branded T-shirts to like show that this is where your wives are. This is what they're doing. This is what they're learning. And then we'd like, this is basically called the Family Farm Day. And we'd provide seedling to the families as well. So like seedling is now going directly to the families from the company to create an outgrow system for the families to be involved in. So not only are the women like making money off the farm that they're working together as a cooperative on, they're now taking the knowledge they have from this program back to their households, taking seedling to their fathers, their husbands, their brothers, and having them get involved in growing it, so that the income is now being doubled on both sides. So when the family starts harvesting, they can sell to the company as well. And that way, everyone is like entrenched in the system where like we're all working together for the same cause. So now you're doubling the income in the household, you're involving the family directly, and they start to see the benefits of the program. And that kind of like shifts the dynamics between the wife and the husband or the father, because he understands what's coming from this program. And you know, we did a lot of like gender transformation, you know, programs where we're like we engage with the youth, with the boys in these communities to see how we can help them address certain issues. Because one thing that started happening is like, because we were so focused on working with women in the communities, everyone would be like, what about the boys? What about the boys? And unfortunately, the boys do get enough attention already. They're already going to inherit the land. But then to make this thing like work for everyone, you have to like make sure that they are also like engaged with. So we developed a curriculum for the boys to sensitize them to like, you know, gender issues, to sensitize them on like GBV, and making sure that ecosystem is like helping everyone in that community grow. And so that was one of the tactics. But it was pretty successful.
I've always believed that that solutions for communities should be local solutions. And this is 100% proof of that, like local solutions, communities getting involved, and then you're able to see real change, you know, being driven. So that's like, honestly, it's incredible. It's really incredible.
Because a lot of times people come in with their ideas and thoughts on how things would work or should work, and it's not the same. Because the reality on the ground is completely different. If you don't address one thing, it shifts the way the program operates. So it's been interesting. I
wanted to just touch on the fact that I just felt so proud as a Ugandan when you were talking about how land is inherited, because you know that quote that says the one thing that God is not making any more of is land. And just as Ugandans, we're really blessed, you know, with the fact that people can still inherit land. In this day and age, it's not something you hear. Most of the land is kind of, you know, it's not privately owned and that kind of thing. So to find that people, even in rural communities or informal communities, they still have land, that is fantastic. And, you know, I think it's just really so awesome.
No, it's definitely one of those things that, you know, that mindset shift that happened. Like there's a point in Uganda where people in rural areas, the dream is to move to the city, to Kampala, to whatever town is next to you, so you can like be part of that. And I used to tell guys in the village, I'm like, listen, man, people need to eat, and the food comes from here. So you need to realize that you are actually creating something that they need. And once you realize the value of what you're creating, and the fact that trucks are coming all the way here to pick it up, and if you guys unionized of sorts, you know, no one likes to hear talk about unions, but I think like for agriculture, it happens in Kenya. They've been very successful with like creating these farmer unions that determine the price, and that's something that's missing in Uganda. So the moment that the farmers start to realize they actually have the power, we have the thing that these guys want. It's like, you know, you don't want to make an analogy to like drug dealers, but drug dealers have drugs, and people come to them to buy what they want. So they'll determine the price. Like, so we have the crop. They want to buy it, we set the price. And we determine what happens. And you can like change your own narrative by just being aware. And like information is like, seriously, is power.
Definitely. Yeah, no, definitely. I feel like this is, it's that whole thing of, and I think that Africa as a whole, we have so much power globally, but we don't realize it, you know, because if people are coming to us, we're the ones who should be setting the price, setting the standards, you know. We shouldn't be doing things based on the way the rest of the world thinks that we should be doing it, especially when it comes to trade and all of that. I think that's one thing that I think could make a huge difference just for the continent if we just all realize our power and we set our own standards.
Yeah, and you're starting to see it though. You know, like with the Ghanaian president, I believe he's the one who was like, hey, you guys want to buy our cocoa and go on. Even Rwanda, Kagame said something like that. You can't take our thing, take it over there, process it, repackage it, and then bring it back to us and sell it for like a much higher price. That makes no sense. So it's time for us to start making that shift.
Yeah.
And I think once Africa, we're losing good leaders because they have that mindset. They're thinking in that way. You know, I don't want to say Gaddafi was a great guy, but he had a vision for Africa.
He had a vision,
that was quickly extinguished.
Yeah.
Because, free thinkers often just get labeled as troublemakers.
I mean, yeah, because that's the thing. I feel as though every situation and leaders are always complex. Like, I'm definitely going to say that, in Gaddafi, obviously, there were a lot of faults, but I know of a lot of Africans, including like on my side and everything, where people are like, Gaddafi actually had a vision for what the continent could be. So it's always complex. And, we're always like, we have to tiptoe around the issue. But where somebody has like a vision that could have brought change, we should give credit where it's due, I think.
Absolutely. I think like Paul Kagame is the epitome of like a good leader.
Yeah.
Like everyone has their view of, for me, like Lee Kuan Yew is who I always rely on to like the idea of like economic progress before freedoms of personality or whatever. And he was like, Singapore was like one of the most rundown countries. That guy came in and it was harsh what they did in the first like 20 years. But where they are now is what I see happening in Rwanda, where it's like, okay, people don't have the right to speak on this and that, but we're fixing the country.
Yeah.
We're getting to like you go to Rwanda now, like Rwanda is like one of my favorite countries in the world. And I'm not Rwandese, so I can't speak on the experience that the average Rwandan has. But when I go there, I'm like, man, these guys are onto something.
They're onto something.
Yeah. But I don't know how we got to politics.
I know, right? But this is the African thing. I'm telling you, I tell people that every time people get into conversations, everything in Africa is like social, political. We're like, because you can't help but think outside of it. Just a few things I wanted to ask you. Obviously, we've just come through a global pandemic, which is probably still around and so forth with COVID. We've spoken to a few people. One of the people that we interviewed, actually a Ugandan lady, she's married to a Nigerian gentleman. They own Kunda kids. And they basically started their business during COVID, and it basically flourished. Like literally this African Kings and Queens series is being given to all these kids around the world, which is fantastic. And they're self-published, self-authored, all of that. And then also another gentleman that we spoke to, Theo Baloyi, he, during COVID, he has a sneaker business in South Africa, which is doing extremely well. And during COVID, they basically were able to shift and be able to increase and to do a lot better with their profits. So I'm curious, from the farming sector, because we haven't spoken to anybody in agriculture at all. Well, how did COVID affect the business?
So COVID, it was tricky. It was tricky in Uganda, for instance, because initially when they had the first lockdowns, it was like full-on lockdown. So there's no movement. And then as it started to shift, so like, okay, farmers can do this, farmers can move at these times. So like the transportation, the business became a headache. So like moving goods from here to there was a headache. And because the markets are not open, so like the public markets where we were doing most of our trading wasn't open, it became quite hard to like sell produce, especially when you're trying to sell in bulk. And then borders are closed, so like a lot of the bulk buyers would buy to like export to like Sudan or to neighboring countries. So that became tricky. However, as it progressed, it relaxed a little bit, and because people were spending a lot more time at home, there was like more purchasing of household products. So like our in-person business became a bit better. So like the supplying individual clients were like the kind of Jumia type client base where it's like, okay, household, they're ordering 5 kgs a week, was starting to like stabilize. And because the bulk people were not buying, the hotels, the restaurants were all closed, that was tricky. But on the other side, it allowed us to start addressing other issues that were like underlying in this NGO space. So we've been doing a lot of work with refugee settlements and doing our programs in refugee camps. And one of the things that became evident was mental health, which is it's just like not addressed in Africa. And because you have families who are now in lockdown being like held in a small house and you can't really leave, no one's making money, that problem started to like grow with the women that we're working with. And sometimes you'll find that you're trapped in the house with your oppressor. So let's say someone has been sexually abused, they're stuck in the house with the person who's been abusing them. And because they can't go anywhere else, it's becoming an issue. So like we were able to develop a mental health curriculum, which we've been testing in 2 refugee settlements. And it's shown like very positive results. You know, that dialogue, opening that chain of dialogue between people in these African communities where usually this type of conversation is just suppressed, has been like a mind shift. And I'm seeing it with more than just beneficiaries of our programs, but I see it with the staff, I see it with, you know, people in general. Mental health is becoming an issue that people are starting to talk about more openly. So, yeah, financially it was difficult, but it allowed us to look at other areas that were currently not being addressed. And we hope to like scale this mental health curriculum into other programs. So we're working with the UNDP, we're working with FAO in refugee camps, and we should be partnering with AFC and potentially with USAID to like try and scale this part of the curriculum.
With everything that you guys are doing at KadAfrica, really, I'm like, the heart of it is really in the right place. So that's really awesome. With regards to climate change is you know, for the longest time within the continent, there was this whole idea that, you know, that thing of climate change was always like, oh, people are like discussing it, they're busy debating it over there, like, how's it affecting me? Like, oh, that kind of thing. But now we're feeling the impact. I know that when I was just before I left Ghana for holiday, I literally was cold. I was just like, what is going on? Like, it's never felt like this. But now I can imagine how much even more climate change affects you in the agriculture sector. What are some of the things that you've seen with regards to climate change, especially because already you're not in control of the day-to-day temperatures. You just pray that God is going to keep the seasons going as they are. But now with climate change, what are some of the biggest dynamics that you've seen, some of the biggest changes? How's it impacted the agriculture sector for you guys in Uganda?
So, yeah, it's a huge, huge issue. Like, even I was one of those guys, like, when people talked about climate change, like, you kind of like, you know it's happening, but you like roll your eyes in the sense of like, okay, get out of here, Greta. You know?
Yeah.
But as someone in agriculture, you start to realize that, like, the rainy seasons either get extra long, which is not good. It's hazardous to crops because things drown. Just the same way, like, for river floods, animals on the side will end up drowning. Your crops rot in the ground, and then the dry seasons are long and unpredictable. So, like, we farmers in rural settings rely so heavily on that, you know, pattern. It's going to start raining in March. It's going to stop raining, so we know we're going to harvest. And it'll happen so, like, sporadically. Like, it'll rain earlier, so people will plant, expecting that the rainy season has started early. Then it just goes dry for, like, 3 months, and then the rainy season starts later. So it's like the unpredictability of the weather has become a huge problem for farmers in Uganda. And we encourage people to like do like water harvesting, and if you can, figure out how to irrigate your farm. But those things are very costly. So it's one of those discussions that needs to be had with governments on how we can like subsidize the cost of certain agricultural products. Or like if we're trying to mechanize farming, how do we go ahead and do this so that the most impoverished farmers are able to benefit from it? And like, what are the plans for like, you know, tree planting, and what initiatives are being taken to like ensure that land, the erosion and things that happen with the flooding are not affecting the farmers. So it's like the conversation is real, man. It's you ask any farmer out there now, and they're just like, man, they don't even know what to do now. It's deterring people from going into agriculture, to be honest.
With all the uncertainty here, I guess policies have to be made, like changes have to be made as quick as possible. And also, like you're saying, governments need to get involved so that they can try and mitigate some of the factors of climate change so that, you know, agriculture can still continue to develop.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And now just another thing, right? Just as we wrap up the interview, I'm very curious about the ecosystem of farming. I'm going to use Theo Boloyi for an example from Batu Sneakers. One of the things in his business is that they basically own the whole end-to-end business. So the stores where the sneakers are sold are his, or other companies. The trucks, everything, the entire ecosystem is under one umbrella, which has been one of the ways that they've been able to really grow this kind of like amazing business. For farming, what is the ecosystem like, and what are parts of farming that people perhaps never thought that there are opportunities? Break down the ecosystem of farming.
No, it's interesting because there are opportunities in certain areas. So like I've seen people who've come in and started like creating organic fertilizer based on the waste that is produced by, let's say, guys who are doing animal husbandry. So cattle farmers in Fort Portal, for instance, who would initially just give away the manure. Started like when we started doing like commercial farming, we'd be like getting trucks of manure from a pig farmer or a cow farmer or a chicken farmer. And then they realized, oh my goodness, wait a minute, these guys are coming every week to pick this up. Let me charge for it. So it like creates this thing of like, oh, there's a business opportunity there. So that is something I've seen happening. The transportation industry is also a big spot. Like people can make a lot of money in, because people who own trucks are the ones who come up country, they pick up the goods and they transport them. In fact, that's one of the things I did early on when I started farming, was I would buy onions in bulk in the hills of Port Portal and then transport them down. So like I would rent trucks and transport the onions and flip them in Kampala. Initially becoming a trader of sorts, which is one thing I despise now. But the trader aspect is there. And then you have like on the other end is like the exporters of produce. So I've seen there are like little hubs. It's hard to find someone who has that entire ecosystem like on their own, unless it's like tea farmers or sugarcane plantations, the Mukwanos, Katepa tea, those guys who've been there and established. I think that with the farmers in countries like Uganda, where it's predominantly smallhold farmers, the biggest opportunity is in like creating these cooperatives of farmers, so that you work with them to like unionize their produce and sell it at a price point that's beneficial for both parties. So like you can negotiate with the companies that buy the sugarcane for sugar and have a group of farmers in one region who are growing something like maize, which is not benefiting them, start growing sugarcane. There's an opportunity there that I see that is just being missed. Yeah. So yeah, they're little bubbles and pockets, but it's hard to like put everything together, especially because with so many different types of crops and so many different like regions growing certain things, if you don't have an end market, it becomes tricky. Yeah. But yeah, there is opportunity though.
Two final questions. The first question is around fair trade and trading. You alluded to the beginning about how when it came to you guys selling your tomatoes before they became tomato paste and tomato jam and all of that stuff. That's the first time that you realized that there was a lot of people would come in and they would be able to set the price, Yeah. So when it came to this kind of thing, like what are the biggest lessons that you learned, that you and your wife learned when it came to trading, and how do you ensure as far as possible with KadAfrica what you're doing with the ladies?
Yeah, I think the main issue I've seen is like there's no like real regulation on pricing. So like pricing is determined by someone in Kampala. I don't know who it is, but there's some guy on Monday morning, he wakes up and says, okay, today I'm buying at this. Basically, the biggest buyer is the one who's going to determine the price. And like with things like fuel prices going up, all of a sudden it affects everything else. And in Uganda, when fuel prices go up, they don't come down. This is the craziest thing. It's like, I remember like a few years ago, it went from like 2,500 to 3,500, and it literally stayed there till the pandemic, and now it's at like 6,000, and I don't see it coming down. So like whoever's buying produce and like sending trucks up country is like, oh, fuel. Now they've said, okay, we're buying this at this price, and because there's no government regulation on price fixing for agricultural crops, it creates a problem for the smallholder farmers. So the farmers were being, short-ended on that side, and I remember driving. I don't know if it's this. Honestly, I can't even remember if this was in a dream or a real thing that I saw. And I was driving, and I saw like a gas station market. And basically, on the gas station it says like diesel, petroleum, whatever, and it shows the prices. I saw something like that in a marketplace, and it was like potatoes, and the price would change every day depending on what the market has decided. And I think that kind of regulation needs to be enforced across the board. So like farmers come knowing that, okay, today I'm selling potatoes at 2,000, tomorrow beans are going to be this price. And that allows them to just dictate what happens. Because when the trader comes, don't tell me about your fuel prices. If you want the food, this is how much it costs you.
Yeah.
So price regulation is a huge thing. It's a huge problem.
Sure.
And that's where the government needs to
step in.
Step in and help.
And finally, I just wanted to touch on this with you and just to get your thoughts around this, around the fact that Africa should be the world's food basket. Now, I remember during COVID being based in Ghana that food prices were really skyrocketing. And one of the things that people were talking about and what was going around was the fact that a lot of the food was being imported. And I thought to myself, wow, as Africans, I had always thought that a lot of the food was being locally produced so that we were able to sustain ourselves.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
And now when you look at what's been going on with the Ukraine war, with the devastation of it, one of the other side effects of it has been the fact that things like wheat have become really expensive, and that is affecting the African continent quite a lot. And I keep thinking to myself, we surely should be able to sustain ourselves, no?
Yeah, because if we mechanize the farming, we have everything we need to actually grow this wheat that is coming from Ukraine. We have these thousands of acres, and we just need to mechanize it to get the right tractors, the right harvesters, everything doing this. We could be doing that, what Ukraine is doing. Because you go to a farm there and you're like, I'll visit farms in the States and I'll be like, oh my God, they only have 2 workers here. Yeah. Because everything is just and I don't want to put people out of work, but then when it comes to the government's role in how we export and import produce, they have the opportunity to actually spend money on building out their government farms to a point that they can create, a stockpile. They can stockpile for situations like this where wheat is now being held from Ukraine or whatever. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't want to blame the government for everything. I feel like young people should also take the initiative to start looking at agriculture as a business and instead of this thing that peasants do. And if they view it as that, they can start changing their own, narrative of how they grow their crops. And it's something that is hard to explain to someone who sees the opportunity of riding a border as quick cash. It's hard to change their mindset and say, oh, no, you can wait 6 months to harvest and then potentially make this type of money when, the weather changes on a day-to-day basis, fertilizers, pests. You have all sorts of problems that you don't think about as a non-farmer. So when you're trying to tell young people that you should do this and they're like, hey, chief, I'm not interested. Yeah. It's hard to make that shift. But the government really should be promoting this type of initiative. And if they were doing that, you'd find a lot more engagement with young people and people in agriculture.
Yeah, I guess it really is also about educating people and knowing what the opportunities are, Yeah. I never even knew that vanilla farming was a thing in Uganda, and I think that's fantastic. I just need to get a vanilla farm and be like, I own a vanilla farm in Western Uganda.
Vanilla is literally like gold. That stuff is so expensive, and it's it takes some time when you're done to just research vanilla. It's I don't want to have to refer to it as a drug trade, but that's the kind of violence you're seeing in the vanilla farming industry, where people are raiding farms and killing for vanilla because it's so expensive. It's insane.
What makes it expensive?
I don't know. I think it's just hard to find. It's there was one time the market crashed in Madagascar because they did they mass produced and then flooded the market, and it created a supply and demand issue. But right now, from what I hear when I speak to Lulu from Dali, it's that vanilla, it's hot. It's hot right now. In fact, I was in Atlanta the other day and a colleague came in from Tanzania. And one of my other friends was like, yo, did you bring my thing? And I was wondering what it was. And she whips out this little bag of vanilla, raw vanilla. And I was like, oh, wow. That was your request from Tanzania. So, yeah, no, it's gold.
This is quite literally going to be my life goal. Get back to me in 2 years. You'll be surprised.
If you're vanilla farming.
I'm telling you.
Yes, you've made it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But Eric, Kaduru, thank you so much. And also, to your wife, Rebecca, just for the work that you guys are doing. It's incredible. I love everything about what you guys are doing at KadAfrica, how you're impacting change, the fact that you think about the community, literally making solutions for the community and empowering the community and getting everybody involved. And also just enlightening us about agriculture, what opportunities are there, and sharing some of your stories, like with the tomatoes. I'm never going to forget. I'm never going to forget that. But yeah, best of luck. And we really look forward to just seeing how far you guys actually take this. Thank you so much for your time.
Cheers, man. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, anytime.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Africa Whisperer. I hope that you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed having this conversation with my esteemed guest. Please, if you want to find out anything more about the podcast, go to theafricawhisperer.com, where you can find out about the team that helps put this production together, my amazing guests that we have each and every week, as well as send any feedback that you might have by emailing hello@theafricawhisperer.com. Also, remember to follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter as Lee Kasumba. Catch you next time. Thanks.